Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Wes, and it's time to take another critical look, a critical perspective of a new Superman comic book this week from DC Comics. They delivered Superman Space Age for $10. That is a very expensive comic book. It probably should be quite good if you're going to charge $10. Unfortunately, Mark Russell is writing this. I'm not a very big fan of this comic book. I don't think Mark Russell's a very good comic book writer. I know he kind of fancies himself some type of social commentary kind of guy. And if he's your flavor of the day, I completely understand it. He has a perspective on the world and a very cynical take on superheroes and what makes them important, stuff like that. It appears that I'm in the minority because the reviews from other critics as well as readers have been overwhelmingly positive, according to comicbookroundup.com. I will definitely be interested to hear from the viewers that have read this comic book and what your thoughts are. I know many of you are familiar with The New Frontier by Darwin Cook, which was essentially a love letter to DC Comics and the Justice League. Darwin Cook understood when these characters were created, they were of a different time, they had different aspirations, and New Frontier stayed true to the essence of the characters while bringing them kind of into modern times and seeing how they would have reacted to certain things like that. So that would be a love letter to DC Comics, bringing them into modern times. Superman Space Age is clearly an homage, or at least Mark Russell's attempt to do what Darwin Cook did with New Frontier, but bring them into even a more modern age and really shake up the characters in Mark Russell's own image as what he thinks is heroic. It comes off less of a love letter to DC Comics and more like an FU or a middle finger to the creators that really were instrumental in creating the DC Comics universe and the characters and stuff like that. I understand a lot of modern comic book readers. If you haven't read a lot of comic books in the past and you've only maybe read comic books for the last 10 or 15 years, you are absolutely used to a deconstructionist take on DC Comics characters specifically. You also see it in Marvel Comics as well, but really primarily in DC, that is the writing trope that they use more primarily than almost anything else, especially when you get a writer like a Tom King, a Mark Russell, people like that. We do get Mike Allred on art here. If you like Mike Allred's art, you're going to like this comic book. Not a lot of action going on here. It's mostly social commentary and changing the origin, essentially, of the Justice League members. And it all kind of centers around the assassination of a political figure. He's pretty much swept away the actual origin stories of the characters in favor of something that he personally prefers better. I'll get into that and why it doesn't really work here. This does appear, at least from this story, to be happening on like a parallel Earth or something like that. It does not appear to be Earth Zero because this Earth apparently dies within Crisis on Infinite Earths. That's pretty much where the story starts out. Now, I have heard the rumor that this was actually going to be the new origin story for Superman and some of the other characters when DC Future State, I guess when it was called 5G, Generation 5 or whatever, that this was going to establish the new origins for the characters moving forward. I do not know that. I've heard that rumor, and I'm glad that it didn't happen if that's what the original plan was, because there are a lot of mistakes here. One of the reasons this has to be from another Earth and it can't be our Earth, Earth Zero, it must be a parallel one, is we do open up and we are in the middle of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Superman is doing nothing heroic. He has basically resigned himself to the entire world dying. He's going in and saying goodbye to the lost city of Kandor. He's saying goodbye to the animals that are in the Fortress of Solitude and all that. And basically, he's helpless. He's not a hero. All life will be extinguished before their eyes, and Superman is doing absolutely nothing. This is not Superman. This is a weird, pathetic, unheroic version of the character. Yes, he's got the same look physically. Yes, he's wearing the suit, but he's not an actual hero. I was surprised that Mark Russell was able to take this moment that was so unheroic and make it even worse in the very next page. Because it turns out John Kent is also in this universe, and he's scared. You know, he's a little boy here, and Clark is making sure that Lois knows that he loved her so much, and did I tell you I love you every day? And his son comes in. Dad, everything's going to be okay, right? No, Jonathan, it's not, because I'm letting everyone die. And then he says, and that's all right. It's okay to accept your fate, that you were powerless in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and there's no reason to go out there and defend yourself, defend your family. This is the most unheroic, bastardized version of Superman that you could ever imagine in your lives. Obviously, we're starting at the end of the story, where this version of Superman and his entire world disappears and is destroyed. And you can see why this world didn't make it. They had a Superman imposter. Sure, he had the powers, but he didn't have the morals. He didn't have the principles. He thought it was heroic to just accept his fate and not keep fighting for himself and his family and humanity at that point. Now, why would Superman be such a pathetic loser that would not fight for himself and his family and all of humanity? Well, I guess it ends up starting with his father. This is an odd take on Pa Kent specifically. There is a little bit of Ma Kent here, but mostly this is a damning kind of story about Pa Kent and what a lackluster father he is in the eyes of Mark Russell. I understand this point of view, my generation specifically, and when I look at Mark Russell, he looks like he's probably my age or perhaps a little bit older. Maybe he's in his older 40s rather than his mid 40s like myself. A lot of us did grow up in single parent homes. I myself being one of those. And I do think it has jaded a lot of the males in my specific generation and their point of view on fatherhood. So I can understand how Mark Russell, if that was his circumstance, could come in here and be like, I don't want a Superman that had a really strong male role model as a father. I want him to have a father that didn't believe in him and just wanted to keep him on the farm, which is a really odd interpretation of Pa Kent. Obviously, Pa Kent has always wanted to protect Superman because he knew he wasn't from this earth. And if people discovered who he was and the powers that he had, they would end up doing experiments and stuff like that. So he wanted him to affect the world and make change and help people, but he wanted him to be careful. And that's pretty much Pa Kent's perspective. But clear to the Superman origin, there is no Superman without Ma and Pa Kent, without their guidance and their influence on his life. He never goes and changes the world and becomes the greatest aspirational hero in fiction history. It has nothing to do with Jor-El. It has nothing to do with his ability to fly. It has nothing to do with his ability to withstand bullets or having X-ray vision or being able to shoot heat beams out of his eyes. The reason he's Superman and he's a hero is because his father was there and loved him, nurtured him, and raised him to do the right thing. That's why Superman Clark Kent is the great aspirational hero of our times. Mark Russell takes a complete deconstruction approach to it, and his father is kind of an a-hole. He doesn't want him to go out. He wants him to just stay on the farm. Don't go out and experience the world. You're just going to get hurt, kid. Like me when I was in World War II, killing Japanese children. That's right, because Jonathan Kent was in the army, and he was in a war zone. That means he must have been out there killing children left and right. Just a terrible page. This is supposed to be moving. And perhaps it would be if this was a new character or wasn't changing a story that was so familiar to readers. Well, when you see it, it's just the most cynical take on Jonathan Kent. I understand one of the big perspectives of this story is anti-war. And I completely get that. As someone that was actually in a war zone, I am not exactly a pro-war person myself, but there's a better way to do it, and you don't have to destroy other characters that are completely established in the process. But in Mark Russell's mind, Jonathan Kent being a good father is a problem. He needs to be a baby murderer. And he's got this big, long monologue from Jonathan Kent talking about the sorrows and pain of war as if he could ever imagine any of it himself, because there's no way in this earth that Mark Russell has ever gone out of his way to do something selflessly for other people, like going off to war and serving your country like that. So, of course, you get his weird, stupid interpretation of going to war. And, of course, we're all baby killers because that's his interpretation of what a soldier is. So there's no call to action for Clark Kent to become Superman. So how did it happen in this universe? Well, it had to come from the death of a politician. It couldn't be from the good morals and upstanding values he learned from his parents. It had to come from the death of John F. Kennedy, because regular people like moms and dads, you can't affect your child's life for the positive. You can't spend every day with your children and really affect their lives. It has to come from an external source. This completely destroys the origin story of Clark Kent. He was never motivated to go out and save people by the morals that he learned from his mother and father and the hard work and the lifestyle that he would have learned from when he was a child growing up on a farm. Because as I read it, Ma and Pa Kent just aren't good enough people. You had to have someone that's a saint now, like a John F. Kennedy, to inspire a Clark Kent to action. And he's not the only one that's inspired by the death of John F. Kennedy. This is essentially how Lex Luthor becomes a supervillain, Bruce Wayne becomes Batman, and Hal Jordan becomes a member of the Green Lantern Corps. And this is a very modern way of thinking about politics and throwing it into characters that are living in a world 40 and 50 years ago. People didn't deify politicians like they do today back in the 1980s or the 60s or the 40s or anything like that. This weird perspective that people have today that somehow politicians are the great savior, and those are the people that are going to get us out of what ails us these days, instead of realizing it's normal people like your mom and dad or your brother or your sister or your best friend that pick themselves up by their own bootstraps and go out there and work hard and get the job done. No, the world must revolve around politics and politicians. It's absolutely ridiculous, especially when you're trying to tell a story of its time, which Darwin Cooke absolutely was able to do. But Mark Russell, because he's so much of his time, he can't think about characters from a perspective other than his own, and you get really stupid stories like this. The worst example being Lex Luthor's plan for the Cold War with the Soviets, which somehow it sounds like Hal Jordan kind of goes along with. There's this really stupid thing where you have like the president of the United States or like a 4-star general are asking a lieutenant pilot what he thinks the best way to approach the Soviets in the nuclear crisis is. It's like no one talks to lieutenants. Lieutenants plan parties and listen to what the captain and the major tell them to do. They don't make policy, and they certainly don't advise on any kind of policy or stuff like that. Is absolutely stupid. And that's another example of just what a sheltered life Mark Russell has lived. He has no idea how military operations work or command structure works because he's probably never had a real job in his life. But this plan by Lex Luthor for the Cold War is the dumbest thing in the history of the world. So his plan is, if we just fire the nukes first at Russia, they'll fire back at us, and 5% of the human population will live, and that's how we'll get out of this. It is the most mind-numbingly stupid idea in the history of the world. It's certainly not an idea that Lex Luthor would have ever come up with because he's actually a genius, and it's certainly not a plan that Hal Jordan would have thought was a good idea. This is beyond stupid. This is Mark Russell thinking that he's writing Dr. Strangelove. The problem is he's not Stanley Kubrick. He's actually not talented. He's not that type of social commentator. So what you end up doing is taking a character that people are familiar with, know what he's capable of, and then coming up with the dumbest plan in the history of all times. And we're supposed to believe this is Lex Luthor. This is just a bastardization of every single character that Mark Russell can get his hands on in this story. It's stupid upon stupid, layered upon more stupid things. And of course, Mark Russell did have to put the last, I guess, nail in the coffin of Jonathan Kent being the father and one of the major impacting figures in Clark Kent's life in becoming Superman. He never really thinks about being a hero until President Kennedy dies. He's called to action because there was a political assassination. He was prevented from being a hero by Jonathan Kent before that. He finally finds the Fortress of Solitude, and finally a real hero's there, Jor-El. His mother, Martha Kent, no longer sewed his first Superman uniform together for him. They no longer play any type of active role in Superman becoming Superman. Of course, it's all got to be Jor-El. I am so tired of people thinking that Jor-El has a profound impact on Clark Kent's life. He calls himself Clark Kent. He introduces himself to other Kryptonians as Clark Kent. He realizes his board name was Kal-El, and certainly he learned things from his father in the Fortress of Solitude. He learned a lot of things. But he learned his humanity. He learned his heroism. He learned all of those things from Ma Pa Kent. But of course, Mark Russell had to destroy that and pull that all out of the character. And of course, it is Mark Russell, so there can be no subtlety whatsoever in the story. Just opening it up with Crisis on Infinite Earths and this other parallel universe being destroyed during that event wasn't enough. Pariah needs to be in a bar, and they have to send Clark Kent to do some investigation. And they have this stupid conversation about how in 20 years the world's going to be destroyed, and I created this contraption, and I met the anti-monitor. It's like, okay, we get it. This thing is supposed to be tied into Crisis on Infinite Earths. Everything apparently in DC Comics needs to be tied into Crisis on Infinite Earths. Like it's like at some point they need to find something else, because Mark Russell just isn't Darwin Cooke. He's not capable of doing what Darwin Cooke did in The New Frontier here in Superman Space Age. This is a bastardization of the characters, and it's so on the nose that they even had to bring in goddamn Pariah into it. And of course, at the end, we do end up getting to meet the first Justice League, and Diana Prince and the Amazons have introduced themselves, likely because of John F. Kennedy. Batman is Batman because he got government contracts because of the assassination of Kennedy, and eventually Hal Jordan ended up finding Abin Sur and all that kind of stuff. And this is his version of the Justice League, but it's just a bastardization of the DC Comics universe and everything that these characters stand for, in my opinion. It's a terrible story. I don't know why people are saying this thing is perfect and giving it 10 out of 10 stars. First off, I like Mike Allred as an artist, but the art alone precludes this comic being perfect, because the art isn't that good. It's just merely okay. And this is a superhero comic, and there's almost no action whatsoever. It's almost 80 pages of people talking to each other about stuff. If you don't like DC heroes in the DC universe and you want a more cynical, grounded take on the heroes, where basically everything that made them special and really made them the heroes that they are today is removed from them, you're probably really into Superman Space Age. It's not as bad as other bad comic books out there. The dialogue is certainly better than you're going to get in a lot of other writers out there. But the social commentary is pretty much over the top. The meta commentary is way over the top. Mark Russell is not a good superhero writer. He should be writing Snagglepuss or Mad Magazine or something like that. You know where he would be good? Go send him to England and let him do 2000 AD and work on Judge Dredd or something. Although I don't think he could handle a character as masculine as Judge Dredd. Let's put that one out there too. I mean, Mark Russell was absolutely a card-carrying soy boy. There's no doubts about that as far as the DC Comics universe. If you're looking for a better interpretation, a better modern spin on Superman, you might not need to look into comic books right now. There's something decent going on in Action Comics, but that's about it. Well, Batman Superman World's Finest. Definitely check that out. But overall, the CW, shockingly, Superman and Lois has a really good interpretation of Clark Kent and Lois. It's really true to the characters themselves while changing the circumstances and the environment that they're in. Definitely check that out. Don't read this.